So, welcome to the Stellar Hour today. I have my guest host, Robin Eubanks, with me today, and we're going to be speaking about Common Core coaching and social engineering. So, Robin, could you take a couple of minutes and please introduce yourself to the audience?
Hi, everyone. My name is Robin Eubanks. I am an attorney. I'm also a mother, and I came to this story accidentally. I was sitting in school meetings, and having been general counsel of a publicly held healthcare company in the 90s, I began to realize that there were connections between what I had seen in healthcare and changes there and what I was hearing from administrators and educators in the classroom about changes that they were making. At the time, I didn't know it, but essentially healthcare and education are two branches of what a globalist would call subjective well-being, and that's why I was seeing connections. And so I started digging in, asking questions, getting angry responses from my ability to ask questions. One thing led to another, and finally had politicians, school board members, parents, teachers tell me, you need to write a book. And finally I realized that was exactly what I needed to do. So I wrote one that came out several years ago. But because I followed the legal mandates that were being put in place in the federal law and state law and regulations, the book is more pertinent now than when it first came out, because it is following what's relevant going forward, in the past, how it all ties together, how the reading.
What's the name of your book?
Huh?
What's the name of your book?
It's called Credentialed to Destroy: How and Why Education Became a Weapon. It looks like this. And it basically explains a lot of things, but one of the things it explains is that the reading wars were never about how to teach reading. The math and science wars were never about how to best teach math and science. They were about how reading fluently changes the brain. So does the logical mind produced by traditional math and science. I came up with a metaphor. I call it the axe maker mind. And the axe maker mind is not, for your purposes of your topic, the axe maker mind is not really subject to social engineering manipulation in the same way. And it's kind of it's not amenable to that kind of manipulation. And so we have a push, what's called constructivism, and the book lays that out. But a lot of times you'll get somebody that talks about constructivism and they'll say, oh, it's discovery learning. No, it's not. Constructivism wants to provide the ideas that you will use both to guide your perception, what you notice and what goes on around you never even pay attention to, and also how you'll interpret the experiences of your everyday life. And that's powerful stuff.
Absolutely. It's a subtle, for most people, it's a very subtle distinction. And it goes into the importance of really understanding what things mean, because one of the things that you said is about, like when you started off talking about subjective well-being. Well, who doesn't want well-being? So they say things in what they're selling or how they're marketing it to make it sound really good. So people don't consider that what's really happening is something different than what they think is happening.
Most words in education do not have the dictionary meaning that the parent hearing it would ascribe to the word. And so I will be in a meeting and as somebody will say, but they told us it was going to be rigorous math. And I said, yes, but rigorous math doesn't mean what you think it means.
What does
higher order thinking skills, personalized learning. Those are just a few of highly manipulative practices that sound innocuous to the parent hearing it. And so they aren't up in arms. And what we find in a lot of instances are effectively gag orders that are in place with teachers. Like, a lot of parents think that teacher tenure has been taken away in all these states because they want to get rid of the incompetent teachers.
Uh-huh.
No, they want to get rid of the teachers who are willing to explain what they've been asked to do and what the intentions are behind it. And if you
Mm-hmm.
are a forthcoming teacher that explains that, you're
Uh-huh.
soon going to be an unemployed teacher.
Wow.
So,
It goes
yeah,
back to being like a, wow.
school boards have been stripped of their authority. I've seen gag orders involving higher ed where professors are being told that if you speak out on these initiatives,
Mm-hmm.
you will not get tenure if you don't already have it. And if you are tenured, there will be no additional promotions and the kind of salary increases. So all over the place, we see legal mechanisms to prevent people from being able to tell the truth about what's going on without risking their personal livelihood.
Absolutely. It's a very powerful way to control people is through their livelihood, because if you speak about the truth and you're going to lose your job, it's like, what are you going to do? It's an incredible double bind. And then not only will you lose your job, but you'll probably be blackballed.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's it. That's its purpose. This is not a side effect of the legislation. It's if you do this, you're going to be destitute. I mean, um, they are using the same kind of behavioral science mechanisms that they're using on students, also on the adults participating in this template, so
Mm-hmm.
that they won't speak out. So
Mm-hmm.
the students are the intended targets, but if an implementer in this scheme wants to speak out, they won't be able to without risking their job. It's comprehensive.
Well, you and I had a conversation before this, and I think what we're starting to see is that people who really want to be able to tell the truth have to be able to either be financially secure already or find ways that they're not going to be dependent on working in organizations where their livelihood could be jeopardized by telling the truth.
I think there's no doubt about it. And I have said repeatedly, I stumbled across this story,
Mm-hmm.
and the more I got into it, the more determined I was to tell it no matter what. It's
Mm-hmm.
just it's not a fun story to know, but the only way to I write a blog and I call it Invisible Serf's Collar.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually had one of my readers a couple years ago, I don't know if you can see this, but they created this graphic for me that says "Not Serfs Yet," and
Uh-huh.
to put on like a bumper or something like that. But the purpose of the metaphor Invisible Serf's Collar is you're wearing a serf's collar under the designs of these education reforms, under the purpose
Mm-hmm.
of basically embedding behavioral and learning standards, but you
Uh-huh.
don't know it. It's an invisible serf's collar.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm trying to make it visible. That's what I do. I write books and I have a blog, and
Mm-hmm.
I am desperately trying to bring the true template to as many people as possible so that when they realize something is wrong, there is accurate information out there.
Mm-hmm. Well,
And
it seems so outrageous. Like as a parent myself, having gone through this, I had no awareness of it until a couple of years ago. And I thought I was a pretty aware person. And I knew about like social engineering from different standpoints, but I was not as aware of how it's happening within the school systems until I began experiencing it myself with my daughter. And I think a lot of parents are unaware that we don't understand that parents are being excluded from a lot of this. And that's part of that game, is that not to let the parents know what's going on.
well, and they use so much data templates now where they're saying, look, your child is learning. We can
Uh-huh.
see from the data that your child is learning. We can see from the data that they're on target to be college and career ready. But
Mm-hmm.
they don't really explain what college and career ready means. And what it means is that they have decided that X concepts and ideas are going to be the lenses that all students use to see the world and interpret their experiences, and they come up with those based on what's politically useful. And it's it's not that you or I are looking at it and go, the function of this is transformative change.
Right.
They say that's the purpose. I put up a link on my blog this morning where it was on project-based learning. And do you know what they proudly announced?
What?
That project-based learning harnesses collectivism.
I am starting to see that word everywhere. How do people not notice when they hear the word collectivism what that really means?
Maybe they had a history class that was grounded in project-based learning. And then the extra credit was the ability to embed social justice issues.
Oh.
So, yes, they're prescribing the concepts, and the ideas that the students, they aren't going to learn a body of knowledge so that they appreciate that won't work. That's been done in the past. That's a bad idea. They'll think, this is what's wrong in our society, and we must fix it. And there's no safety mechanism that causes them to go, you just can't redesign the world. You can't push these ideas that you're trying to push without all these negative side effects, because they're not being told that. And so, yeah, I'm not going through this stuff and saying, I think this is the way it works. I do that preliminarily, and that's what will get my attention into something. But generally, until I find a creator who is in a position to, make it so, they have authority, they're well connected, and they say what the purpose is. And then, if it's online, I grab a screenshot, I download it. If it's footnote in a book, I find those old books. And at that point, we're not theorizing about what's going on.
Right.
We're reporting what's going on. We're using the words of the people involved and what they say the purpose is. And at that point, we ought to take their word for it.
But, it's really about being able to put the pieces together and recognize what it really means, because there's so many good sounding words. Like we hear words like change and change management, transformation, well-being. They use all of these words to hide what they're really doing, such that people, they can't discern what's really happening as a result from all of these different things. And I mean, we look at the overlay, like how you and I connected, is that I started recognizing and reading your blog and things that I started recognizing with the coaching world, that, wow, there's an incredible amount of overlap here. And the players are the same. So, you've been blogging about Keegan and Wilbur. The people are the same people who are involved in all of this, and they're affecting different areas. So they're affecting education, they're affecting leadership, they're affecting nonprofit world, NGOs. We're finding the same people involved in everything.
That's because they're all grounded in developmental psychology, and all those people are developmental psychologists. So the same people who are creating the template for what is going on in higher ed reform, Keegan, it's something I go over it in the book, but the Crucible Project's cognitive, intrapersonal, and interpersonal competencies that are to be the basis of higher ed reform come from Keegan. The OECD's key competences that are what they look for in the PISA assessment that guides education globally, that's on 15-year-olds, that's Keegan's work. When I read ICF, International Coaching Federation's core competencies at the recommendation of somebody in the coaching world a few weeks ago who said, I think there's, similar to you, I think there's overlap here. And I looked at it and that's, the purpose is not to convey a body of knowledge. The purpose is to change the adult, executive, or whoever is at the level of their mind, at the level of their personality, to get at what their purpose is, what motivates them to act, what causes them to create the goals in their lives, find out what it is, and change it.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
so, yeah, it is tied together, but it's tied together at the level of developmental psychology, and they say so. I wrote a post yesterday about a book from Steve McIntosh, and I mentioned that he was tied to Carter Phipps, and Carter Phipps shows up in the ICF world. So yeah, and they belong to a Center for Intentional Evolution. So we don't have to speculate about what it is that they want to do. They've told us in books. So, and yes, I tie it together.
Intentional evolution, huh? It sounds like eugenics to me.
It's not eugenics. What it is recognizing that if you can get at people's perceptions, if you can get at what guides, especially if you can ground their knowledge, their cognition, what goes on in their mind, if you can ground that in emotion,
absolutely,
then it changes how it is they see the world. And if you can, there's a famous guy, I probably am mispronouncing his name. It's Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, and I just referred to him as Chick, C-S-I-K, because those are the first four letters of his name. But the same thing, he wrote a definition of excellence. You hear all the time, equity and excellence, equity and excellence. And essentially, the civil rights laws are being interpreted to compel excellence in our local schools. So there's not an achievement gap. But in order to get excellence, if you look at Chick's definition, you have to combine what's thought, what's desired, and what's felt. That's not the intellect as we have traditionally known it. That's not the intellect that did proofs in geometry. That's not the intellect that figured out algebra. Right. That's something else. And that's manipulating the mind and manipulating what images the students encounter. You know, they talk about how powerful that image is of spaceship Earth and showing the students what the Earth looks like from space, and then manipulating that image so that they see that the Earth is in peril and that they must do something, and how powerful images are.
Well, and think about all of those images are made up. They're all composites. So how do we even know that those images are real? It just goes back into them architecting what people perceive, goes back to what you said about, you know, people's perception and how they're making meaning of what it is that they're experiencing. And to your point, they're being told what they should experience and then working from that.
It's worse than that, because so much learning now is embedded in computer software. So the computer software, and a woman by the name of Jane McGonigal, who is with the Institute for the Future, she gave a keynote a couple years ago, and she said point blank in her keynote and also in a book she wrote that the beautiful thing about, you know, virtual reality is you can cause the software to create learning experiences that will cause the students to be worried about the issues you want them to be worried about. And they don't understand that the software has been deliberately manipulated, because software does what it's designed to do. And the design is not to simulate the world as it exists. The design is to create a perception in the student that the world that exists needs to be changed, and this is why. And so they experience virtual, and the body doesn't differentiate between what's lived in virtual reality and what's lived in physical reality, except physical reality can't be manipulated in the same way. So the student's highly manipulated, but they don't really realize it.
Well, it's the same thing when people watch a movie, they go into what's called suspension of disbelief. And it's like when you see a person crying at a movie, what's happening? It's the same type of thing. They're not really crying about what's happening in real life. They're crying about the virtual reality that's created through the movie. And the
Yeah,
same things are happening in this virtual learning.
it is,
People are
but most
conflating.
of the time it's a teenager or an adult in a movie. We're
Hmm.
talking about students. I mean, a lot of parents, when they heard that preschools were going to have to be accredited, they thought that means, oh, it'll be a high quality. No, the
Right.
accreditation, again, is a compliance device. And
Hmm.
the accreditation meant that they could introduce social and emotional learning standards, criteria on the need to collaborate in the classroom,
Hmm.
all of that into preschool situations.
Wow. Adding to that, and I'm kind of going off on a tangent, here in Arizona, in kindergarten, they're considering offering sex ed. So imagine this. It's like all of these things coming together. What's happening to our children? I mean, they're being inducted into this absolutely bizarre world that being they're trying to get them to accept as normal and real.
That's true. That's very true. And um, I think, again, some of the sex ed push is about playing on just how powerful images are,
Uh-huh.
and the experiential aspects,
Uh-huh.
so that what in the past might have been viewed as aberrant
Uh-huh.
is something that they think is just a matter of personal preference.
Right.
And you get into the fact that if you have a good knowledge of history,
Mm-hmm.
some of these practices were traditionally prescribed for reasons of mental health or physical health. And if that's not appreciated, then you're setting up the kids ultimately for a, an adult life of instability, I think.
But isn't that the key? Because the more and I think this is what the whole thing is about, is creating this lack of stability. You breaking down the family, creating through social events like all of these perceptions that there's nothing that's safe anymore, right? Everything is unstable. It kind of goes back into the Kurt Lewin formula of changing people's values, making things fluid, unfreezing people, and then making them fluid such that they will take in new values that they're not even aware that they're taking in, and make them foundational to themselves and adopt them. And so I think that's an incredible part of what's happening right now, that people are not aware of how their perceptions and values are being manipulated.
I was at a PTA meeting that involved some school board members, and it was mostly administrators. It was open to the public, but not really anybody in the public was there.
Uh-huh.
And they were talking about how to deal with the administrators who didn't realize I wasn't on board with the template. That's actually why I was there, to see what I could hear.
Uh-huh.
And they were talking about the teachers who still wanted to teach the subject.
Uh-huh.
And the administrator announced that what everyone should do was use Kurt Lewin's, Lewin,
Yep.
freeze, unfreeze, refreeze technique on the teachers who still wanted to make the subject matter the emphasis. And I thought, and that's how presumptuous they are, is that they will quote someone who's notorious,
Uh-huh.
advocate using their technique, and never understand, they're notorious. That's not in the knowledge that was part of their their EDD program.
Absolutely.
And secondly, how horrendous it is to basically be telling an adult professional that, again, change what you think the purpose of education is, or find another job.
Absolutely. People, it's interesting that you bring that up about Lewin being notorious, because in my world, in the coaching world, people just think of him as like being a god. One of my mentors actually dedicated his book to Kurt Lewin, and I thought to myself, oh my gosh, if you only knew what a nefarious person he was. His involvement in the Macy conferences, cybernetics, and social engineering, there was nothing beneficial to all of humanity. But certainly was beneficial to whatever it is that they're trying to accomplish, whether it be their religion or their worldview. But people can't even begin to comprehend how a smaller group of people like this could really influence the way that our world works and how people perceive.
Yeah, you don't very often admit that you're glad somebody unexpectedly died of a heart attack relatively young in his 50s.
Mm-hmm.
But given where he was going, I'm kind of glad he didn't live to a ripe old age, because he would have had a whole lot more time to put those theories of group behavior and develop them, and then it wouldn't be other people evaluating his research. I mean, his research is, the Social Research Institute at Michigan, which is also where education in the United States research is located. So you have Kurt Lewin Social Research Institute at the University of Michigan, and that's the same place that education research is based in the U.S.
Wow.
So they get to talk to each other.
Not just talk.
Yeah.
They're probably
together.
Robin, they're collaborating together.
They have been collaborating together for decades, and but they have put a lot of that into papers and a lot of that into books.
Oh.
And I've tracked them down, and as my family says, that they're books all over this house, but they're confessional books. They're, they lay out what their plans are. And the thing is, when you read the books, is when I read the book I talked about yesterday, mm-hmm. and you really understand how learning standards or a competency framework works, you recognize that what they're doing is they'll say, oh, if only we had a way to get this into effect. Well, guess what? They do, because that's how learning standards work. Mm-hmm. And the fact that they're not appreciating that learning standards are being mandated under federal law, and a state plan filed under the federal law, means that there's already a way in to this, and it's at the level of the mind. That's what the data is about. I get so annoyed when I hear people talk about data, and they keep talking about personally identifiable information. You can manipulate the mind and personality any which way you want to, and never get to the level of personally identifiable information. So it's not that I think mining personally, PII as I abbreviate it, is okay, but that's not the problem involving this data collection. And one of the things, a lot of people have heard of outcomes-based education, but I laid out the template for its ultimate goal, something called transformational outcomes-based education, which you would be able to see is clearly tied to Lewin's work, among others. And once you read that template, it's you recognize it under its new names now. And that's very important. So once we can get to the true theory, it doesn't matter if it gets renamed. It doesn't matter that what used to be in one place has been broken into 4 or 5 interconnecting parts, so that people won't guess how they piece together. Once you understand the theory, you got it. And that's why I write. That's why I do interviews, because it is a potentially it will be a tragedy.
It already is a tragedy.
It is a
look
tragedy.
At what's happening now. I mean, it's unbelievable. I want to show you something I found. So I'm going to try to share my screen. Where is it? So I went, share. So I'm going to enlarge this. I found this chart online, and it brings all of these people together. Like we were talking about it. Oops, I went too far.
Yeah, I know a lot of those people.
It's like, and I started seeing it. So there's another one I found, which I showed you. I'm going to switch back real quick. This is an easier one to look at. when I started recognizing this, I started to think, oh my gosh, the work I'm doing that I thought was really helpful in executive leadership coaching. Look at it.
Uh-huh.
When I found this chart, it all starts like with Werner Erhard. I
Yeah,
was like,
I
it
think,
blew my mind.
Warner, who keeps popping into my attention.
Uh-huh.
It's interesting. He has something called the Mastery Foundation,
Uh-huh.
and the Mastery Foundation and what it pushes. He talks about having created the technology of transformation, and what he seems to be doing is not that he created it. It's that he became aware of it and became the person who pushed it in executive coaching. So it's more that he's a transmitter of something that was highly lucrative
Uh-huh.
than that he created it. It's that old developmental psychology template. Cybernetics is a part of system science, and most of the people who are involved with developmental psychology and this change that I call transformational outcomes based education are also grounded in system science, because they believe that the mind can be turned into a system that can be manipulated. And
Absolutely.
that's what's, I mean, based on those competencies, that's what it looks like to me. It looks very similar to outcomes-based education, and outcomes-based education was originally known as mastery learning. So, and I've seen there's a upcoming conference in China that you had David Cooperrider on that previous chart. One of the people that works with David Cooperrider at Case Western
Yeah.
is Christopher Laszlo, and he's going to be at that conference in China coming up and sometime this fall. So there's a UN affiliated basically rework of business schools globally in the nature of management education. It's called
Uh-huh.
PRME is the acronym for it.
Uh-huh.
And Cooperrider is involved in that. So is Case Western is where they hold the annual conferences. Christopher Laszlo, and Christopher Laszlo's father is Irvin Laszlo,
I
the
was just
famous
going to
system
ask.
scientist who is tied to the UN, and he's got a brother called Alexander Laszlo. Alexander Laszlo is involved in Global Education Futures Forum, which is the global template for education change, and he's also involved in ISS, the International Society of System Science, which he used to be president of within the last 5 years or so. So
Wow.
it's again, once you understand the template, you realize that you're not imagining things. They are tied together. They go to conferences. There's such a thing as a Making Meaning conference, and they talk about how to target how the mind will make meaning and
Mm-hmm.
how it will interpret experiences. And a lot of people, they think charters were an answer, a way out. I used to think that before I looked into the stuff, and now you're seeing, well, charters aren't, it's because Betsy DeVos gave them a bad name, so people are moving away from charters. They don't
Mm-hmm.
really need charters anymore, because the purpose of the charter was to lock in this vision of innovation and see how it works based, action research. So
Mm-hmm.
they have been using charters for those purposes for a couple of decades now, and they have a pretty good idea which theories work or can be made to work and which ones they need to go back to the drawing board with. So
Uh-huh.
charters have served their purpose. And if you ever read a charter, it's pretty shocking what the language actually said. They invariably lock in a whole child, change the child vision in that charter, but people don't read it.
Well, they don't think to read it, and they're also difficult to read.
Well, not for me.
But thankfully there are people like you that do this. But for many people, it doesn't even make sense. It's like I had to update something on my Apple phone, and they sent me like a 15-page agreement, and I'm thinking to myself, this is what they do. They overwhelm people with so much information, and most people don't understand it.
I read the local district's charter, and I
Uh-huh.
was horrified because essentially they had taken the transformational outcome-based education template that
Uh-huh.
I knew from writing the book and put it into mandatory language in the charter. And the school board thought that they were locking in an academic model when they were in fact doing anything but. And I read a subsequent charter for a couple years ago, and they had moved on to a template that was pioneered over or implemented in Queensland, Australia.
Uh-huh.
And as transdisciplinary education. And they it was what was locked into the language of the charter was the transdisciplinary template. And so you
oops, sorry.
You were talking.
I guess I'm listening to you say all this, and I think to myself, what are the outcomes that you're seeing? What is going to be the impact? So I would hope that we still have an ability to affect some of this, and henceforth why we're doing these interviews. But beside that, like, what do you see their outcome is of this?
The outcome is essentially you will have programmed the mind and personality of students every bit as effectively as we talked about writing the software, so that the software does what it's designed to do. It's just that what it's designed to do is not appreciated by the parents, right, in terms of what the actual learning is, what the actual effect of those experiences is. Well, same thing is true with the students. There's a reason why people go to MIT, get a doctorate in artificial intelligence, and then go to work at the graduate program of School of Education at Harvard. And that's not like there's one of them. There's like, it's like a train. They might as well run a shuttle from the graduation at MIT to the hall where they have the School of Education. It's that common.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, I think that's the effect. I think the purpose is, I don't think the purpose is, they say the purpose is transformative. They want to transform the political, economic, and social systems in our society. They want to, Steve McIntosh, in the part of the book I didn't quote, says that they want to create a system of global governance. They have no intention of having a world parliament. They plan to create the global governance system through learning standards and imposing them at the level of the mind, so that they create neurological change. Mm-hmm. They make sure that the neurological change is in place during the relative years where the brain is most plastic. Mm-hmm. And then they have a pretty good idea what the future behaviors are, what's going to motivate somebody to act. And you get a cooperation between the media and educators, so that the themes that the media is pushing are the same things that the educators have locked into what they call power standards as the concepts that they embedded and made sure would be the ideas that the students are using to think through these problems. So it's just, the student hears it and it's like a red light goes off, because they've been trained to react to and use these concepts and see them as the reason we need transformative change. And the templates are all there. That they coordinate together. They go to conferences together. They always have the conferences in the kind of places most of us would like to stay at but can't afford. They'll have it at, the fancy luxury hotels. And, one of the benefits when I first started doing this was that if you were an educator that was signed on early to this, you got to go stay at this fabulous hotel in San Francisco or New York, or go abroad and do these conferences. So, you got to see the world at taxpayer expense in a 5-star fashion. Wow. That's pretty alluring for a certain type of person.
Oh, for sure. And a feeling of power too.
Yeah.
And I think about this, how do people not recognize how the influence that they're having on other people? Like, you think about, I see a confluence also, Robin, between what we're talking about, and I don't know if you've noticed the plethora of information coming out about smart cities over the last year.
Oh yeah, I've got a lot of that, and that ties into the UN's agenda. They call them learning cities, and have all kinds of books that they've written on how it all ties together. There's something called the right to the city that ties into. They have what they call social determinants of health,
uh,
and
wow.
all these policies. Essentially, they get to create the goals. They make them a legal mandate. They gather the data, and this is highly cybernetic. They gather the data and then measure the difference between the goals that they've created and what the situation is. If
Negative
they need a
feedback.
new theory to get to what that goal, they come up with that new theory. But they're, the same thing you have, what they call continuous improvement in education is
Right.
comparable to the SMART goals for a city. But they believe that you can create, these are the goals, this is the transformative change we want to see, and we're not going to have it. We're not going to do it like the old Soviet Union. We're not going to lock it into a 5-year non-flexible plan where we're trying to centrally plan everything and we end up with no wearable shoes or everything's for the left foot. No, we're going to be flexible in our central planning. We're going to implement it at the local level where they actually have control over the two things we need, people and place. And then we're going to use the data that's being thrown off by all sorts of things, including people's smartphones, for goodness sakes. And we're going to figure out where the people are and what's being changed and what else we need to do to get the world that exists to where we want it to be.
Well, which is going to be people living in smart cities, getting a basic universal income. It reminds me of something from the We Forum where it says, I own nothing, I have nothing, and I'm happy, right? So talk about being a serf. You have nothing. And you're living in your tiny house, of course.
And what it is a politically organized society. It puts the premium on political power, and the pejoratives that get used. And the thing is, it's not just that it's a matter of people who are admitted progressives. What I find over and over again is this progressive, what was called Marxist humanism, the idea that we are at a sufficient level of wealth in the world. We have a sufficient level of technology that's been produced by capitalism, and the big technology is computers, the internet, and now we can proceed to what was the actual vision from each according to his abilities, to each according to their needs, which is to create a moral revolution that's internalized, and that moral revolution is more interested in collectivism than individualism.
It goes into
they target the individual to change them towards this collectivist vision, and that's not accidentally how these learning standards work, like the Common Core, like prescribed competencies, and it all ties together.
I remember last year I was listening to something, a coaching program that's very popular. And one of the speakers, who of course comes from Tavistock and teaches a lot at the Aspen Institute, was talking about how we've moved from IQ to EQ to WeQ. Okay. And it's this whole thing of collectivism. You see everywhere the we, creating we. It's all about we. It's no longer team, it's now we.
Yeah, they wanted to, there's a book in education called Descartes' Era. The I think, therefore I am. Well, they want to make it a matter of we feel, therefore we are. Exactly. And one of the things when I was looking into, after I looked at the core competencies, I discovered that some of the coaching management groups are highlighting that what used to be the National Training Laboratory under Kurt Lewin in Bethel, Maine, has now moved to Washington, D.C. as a think tank. So that all of this stuff, NTL, and it was listed as being one of the partners on the executive coaching that laid out all the changes they wanted to create at the level of the mind. And I just looked at it and said, oh my word, that is an acronym that traces back to the research lab that NEA created in Bethel, Maine. And now it's not in Bethel, Maine anymore. It's in DC. And essentially they're taking the research they did under Lewin and afterwards based on his theories, and now they're applying it in coaching. It's like, no wonder we're seeing so much commonality. They're using his work, that education lab, and my understanding is that the education lab used to have like a advisory warning saying essentially some of the methods that we'll be using if you participate may create mental issues.
Are you serious?
That's what people who've been at it for a long time have told me. So that's what's now been mainstreamed.
Right. Well, because Kurt Lewin was known for large group awareness training, which came out of Tavistock and was tied in the work of Fred Emery and Wilfred Bion, or however you say his name. All of these things were brought together such that you bring groups of leaders together. And under the memes of like purpose and vision and mission, you start to change people's values, and they don't even realize their values are being changed, and then they adapt them and think that they're their own, and they don't even realize what they've gone through.
As part of the large group awareness training, this idea, what I find in education is that you can come to the group with your own meaning, but you can't leave the group with your own meaning. You've got to come to a shared meaning within the group, and then that shared meaning binds everyone in the group to be the new definition that guides their behavior. And we see that in education. It goes under the name of discourse classroom. It goes under the name of communication for social change. It goes structured design dialogue. But they all are this idea that you can start with your own meaning, but you can't leave with your own meaning.
Well, same thing with culture, right? Think about organization, culture, and cultural values. Gallup just came out with an interesting article about that. How to get people to adapt the cultural values and live it. And the thing is, just like with teachers, if you don't follow the protocol that's being laid out for you, and you're an employee in a corporation, and you don't extol the values that you're told you must, well, where does that leave you? With a poor performance rating, or you get exited out of the corporation.
Yeah, the culture is nothing but the aggregate of what's in the majority of the individual mind. So if you get something like learning standards where you've prescribed what will be in individual minds from the course of education, or they won't get promoted, then you're standardizing, hence the name learning standards. That's just what they don't quite appreciate, but it's actually, there is, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, and learning standards are part of their work. This isn't accidental. And then those learning standards tie to something called SETS, Common Education Data Standards, that's based out of University of Colorado in Boulder. And then SETS ties to UNESCO's work. They've created something called the International Standards for the basically education data. So it all ties together, and it's all this, they're specifying these are the concepts we want them to use. This is how we want them to act given an environment. And these are the values, the disposition, the motivators that we want to instill in them. They're all specified.
Well, it's conformity. So
it
standards.
Is conformity. I don't think they're going to like either one of us in that vision, are they?
No. They don't want people that can think. What was the word that you use at the very beginning?
Mind. Isn't that a good metaphor of what they really don't want?
Yes. And then they really don't want people like who have those axe maker minds to connect with each other.
They do. Education is now committed to mind arson, which is another one of my metaphors. And because if you don't know why you believe what you believe, if it's not grounded in deep knowledge, then you're subject to what they talk about lifelong learning, which is that you'll adjust based on the new goals that they created, and you'll be amenable to that. You won't go, this is BS,
Right.
This is why this won't work. These have been the results in the past of comparable initiatives. Um,
You see lifelong, or I'm laughing because you see lifelong learning everywhere now. It's embedded. I mean, the words become so predictable. Once you start seeing the words, to your point, it doesn't matter if they rename it because you can see the same narratives, because that's how they do a lot of this. They're crafting narratives.
They
And
do
so
craft narratives. And
you see
the
the
thing
word.
about a narrative, it doesn't have to be true in order to guide your behavior and to motivate new behavior and guide your goals. And they have literally created another interesting term, guiding fictions. And guiding fictions, it kind of goes back to what we saw involving the software and creating virtual reality for an end result. Well, the guiding fictions don't have to be true either. If they motivate your behavior in
Mm.
desired directions, that's the purpose of the guiding fiction.
Wow. You know what pops in my mind is what happened a couple years ago with Pokemon Go when people were just going crazy. I had a friend who lives in Wisconsin, and she lives in a very affluent area, and across the street was a private park. And she said, Kathy, you can't believe 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning, people are out there like this with their phones, like looking for these virtual monsters. And so it was something completely virtual, not real. But it was really affecting the reality of people's lives, such that they were consumed with this program of Pokemon Go, which I think was a really big social experiment. So, to your point, people can conflate what happens virtually with what's happening in real life.
Well, it's not just a social experiment. The fact that you downloaded that program to your smartphone
Yeah.
meant that they were throwing off a tremendous amount of data about themselves
Oh, yeah.
that was very highly useful. What it goes back to what we were talking about, personally identifiable information.
Right.
Big data doesn't really care about personal identifiable information. It cares about personal characteristics and what
Uh,
you're doing. So that,
can you tell me a little
you
bit
know,
about that? Like, what do you mean by personal characteristics?
where do you live? It's
Uh,
not that they care about your particular address, but they care about how many people in the affluent part of town are doing the Pokemon Go versus people in a less affluent part of town. That's personal characteristics. So
okay.
the earmarks of your identity that aren't your name, they're not your religion, but they are telling them a whole lot about what somebody from a certain background is willing to do under X learning experience. That's what they care about. Do they care about the fact that X curriculum, learning experience created the desired change in this white student whose parents went to college and have some grad school? They don't care about your name. They don't care about where you live. But that's useful information for them. So when they have a student in another part of the country with those same personal characteristics, the learning registry, which is again exists,
Uh huh.
they will use that same program to try to create the desired change in that student with those characteristics.
Oh, wow.
So that's why personal characteristics. So when you get parents all about talking about we're protecting the student, privacy. Yeah,
Right.
you're protecting their privacy in terms of who they are, but it doesn't mean that all of this noetic change, which means essentially it's at the level of the mind or the personality, what's internalized, all of that's not taking place. So they have no desire to create a static database of information. They want to change your student. They want to change your child. They want to change how they see the world. They want to change how they're going to act in the world. And so while you're obsessing over whether they are trying to figure out your religion or your child's name,
Uh huh.
they're being neurologically redesigned from the inside out. So you're
Wow.
completely missing the point of why we're doing all these changes.
That brings another, I mean, I hadn't really thought about it that way before. And that really brings up something we have just a couple minutes left, but I'd love to have you back on and talk about that, because I think that there's so many things like you've touched on today, the average parent, I can say I thought I was a pretty aware parent. I had no idea this stuff was going on in this way. You wouldn't know unless, like, you had like a mind like your own, or things came up and things started to come to your awareness to say, hey, this really isn't making sense. This isn't the way that school was when I was growing up. It's very different today. And I don't think, as a parent, I couldn't imagine how different school is if I hadn't been in contact with you and other people who have helped me to become aware of this.
I think one of my great epiphanies when my children were younger is when and this was in private school, and a lot of parents don't understand, in private schools it can be even worse than public. You can change a private school much faster than you can change public education. You get a new headmaster in there that's a true believer, and you take the independent school board on a retreat, and they have a certain kind of executive coach, and next thing you know, they're all on board with shared meaning on how the school should change, and that's it for that private school. And unbeknownst to me, that's essentially what had gone on where my children were. And so I heard the lower school principal explain something, and then I made an appointment to come in, and I said, if I heard you correctly, you said X, Y, and Z. And she was furious with me for accurately understanding what she had said in the meeting. And she went nuts. So, and my husband kept saying, you really must have said something to her. And I said, didn't say anything disrespectful. All I did was ask the right question. And
Exactly.
She realized that I had interpreted correctly what she had said their intentions were in terms of changing the nature of what was going on in school. And I was like, why would that cause such a commitment? Well, now I know. It took me a while to put the pieces together, but they needed to change the private schools on a comparable schedule, or even ahead of the public school.
Would the same thing be happening in charter schools, Robin?
Well, the purpose, again, to go back, the purpose of the charters is actually to implement the innovative model and see what the effects are. And the charters, the template was developed by a man named Bella Benathi. And Bella Benathi was involved with the General Evolution Research Group. He was also involved with the Center for Advanced Studies of Behavioral Sciences that's now out at Stanford, been there since the early 50s. If you hear about growth mindsets all the time in education.
Carol Dweck's work. Ugh.
Right. And Angela Duckworth, the Mindset Scholars Network is based at the Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral Sciences now. So the same place that developed the charter is now behind creating the growth mindset and implementing and seeing what the data is showing for implementing the theories. But growth mindset goes back to changing the values, attitudes, beliefs, and ultimately the behaviors of the students so that it's invisible. You have changed it at a neurological level. And
same thing in business, Robin. I mean, the growth mindset is everywhere. And I found some papers that took her data apart and proved that she didn't really have the statistical correlations that she said she did.
But she doesn't need it. The purpose was to put the theory into the classroom, not for the theory to be correct, for the purpose that people assumed it was being put in place for.
You're right.
No. So, it's fascinating stuff. You kind of have to have a sense of humor about it, It's not because it's humorous, it's not. But people have tried, there have been lots of schemes in the past to make these changes. What I have found is there is not a parent out there on board with this agenda. It doesn't matter who they vote for. It doesn't matter how they identify. They are not on board with this transformational neurological template for education for political engineering, social engineering purposes.
Right.
So all I know to do is the facts they're easy to document. I have documented them. I tied them together. and I just keep telling the story.
Could you please let the listeners know what your website is? You have so much incredible information on there. So if they wanted to do research, what a great place to start with that in your book.
Again, my book is called Credentialed to Destroy,
Mm-hmm.
How and Why Education Became a Weapon.
Mm-hmm.
And my blog is called Invisible Serfs, SERFS, Collar. I was a history major. It seemed like a good metaphor. You remember, you could tell that the serf was a runaway because they still had that serf collar on, and you knew that they had illegally left the area that they were confined to. It's an invisible serf's collar. You don't physically see it, but it's in place, and it's designed to have certain effects until you're aware of it. And awareness of the template is the way out.
Wow. Thank you so much, Robin. I'd love to have you back on again so you can just share with our audience your insights and your incredible research. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me on, and I appreciate it.
Thanks,
Have
Robin.
a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Stop video. Okay. Are you there?
I'm still here.
Video. Okay. That is like so fascinating, putting these pieces together. And I think it'd be really interesting, like, for parents to understand, like, how do you begin to like put the pieces together? What are some things they could, like, I'd love to do a show, like, what can they look for? What are some of the things they should start being aware of? Like, I got an email from my daughter's school saying, oh, guidance counselors are going to be meeting with the children, but you're not going to get any information until after we're done. So basically, we don't want you parents interfering with what we're doing. Like, really?
What, you know, when I speak, I get people who've driven hours, and what they'll show up with my book, and they'll tell me how many different times they've reread it. They've got writing in the margins, and it's literally, once you see the basic template, and obviously I'm well beyond that, but Credentialed to Destroy remains the basis for appreciating the desired foundation out there. And when you know that template, then you can recognize that what you're looking at is a new name for what I laid out. You know, I've talked about the fact what I laid out as transformational outcomes-based education is now in most state plans as a portrait of a graduate. These are the characteristics. This is the way we want them to act in the world. This is essentially who we want them to be. And if you know the earlier template, you can recognize that this is related. You can recognize that the three things that they just put in that the school's going to introduce this year are three elements of a previous theory that was notorious. So facts is the way in.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate this. I think that this is like such important information. And I've just been going through and looking more about like my own work and thinking about coaching. I met with clients yesterday, and they will bring up some of the stuff about the growth mindset. And I'm just like, I can't even hear it anymore, because it's like, I didn't know either. I think about like the certification I got within competency management and how I participated in all of this and wasn't aware of it. You know, it's mind boggling.
Most of the people who are designed with the growth mindset work, especially Carol Dweck, were Lev Vygotsky scholars before they came up with this name, growth mindset. And Lev Vygotsky was I cover him in my book. He was a Soviet psychologist, and he was coming up with a method of education that would create the perfect Soviet man. He died. He probably would have been sent to the gulags, but he died of tuberculosis before that. But it's his work, and when his work was first published in English in around 1958, I think the date is, the guy who did it was, his name escapes me now. He's a Harvard professor. Will come to me after we're not talking. Anyway, it was a 300-page book in Russian,
Uh-huh.
It was only 100 pages when he translated it because he had to take out